You are listening to KSG Podcast. This is a short, crisp, concise, exam oriented, edited editorial for civil services aspirants. In this podcast, we are going to talk about could Ukrainian neutrality help end the Russian war? Source for the content is the Indian Express. In talks between Russia and Ukraine towards a possible ceasefire after 3 weeks of intense fighting in March 2022, negotiators are exploring prospects of possible neutrality for Ukraine, a former Soviet republic that has been moving closer to NATO in hopes of membership, infuriating Moscow. The discussions have brought a glimmer of hope of a possible way out of the bloody crisis in Ukraine and followed an acknowledgement from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in the most explicit terms yet that Ukraine is unlikely to realize its goal of joining the Atlantic Alliance. An official in Zelensky's office said the talks have centered on whether Russian troops would remain in separatist regions in eastern Ukraine after the war and where borders would be. Ukraine also wants at least one Western nuclear power involved in talks and a legally binding document on security guarantees. In exchange, Ukraine was ready to discuss a neutral military status, the official told the Associated Press on the condition of anonymity to discuss the sensitive matter. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Vladimir Medinsky, the chief Russian negotiator, first mentioned publicly on 16th of March 2022 that the issue of a neutral status for Ukraine was on the table, sparking a guessing game about what that might mean. But even should a deal be struck, there's no assurance it would hold. Russia, many critics say, has gravely violated international law and its own commitments by invading Ukraine in the first place. In the view of Russian President Vladimir Putin, the West has breached what he considered its obligation not to expand NATO into Eastern Europe. Now, what is neutrality today? It's about not picking sides, keeping out of binding alliances, and trying to stay out of conflict. But even supposedly neutral nations have their limits. European countries often mentioned when the concept of neutrality comes up are Switzerland, which, like Austria, has codified neutrality into the constitution, as well as Sweden, Finland, Ireland, and once upon a time, Belgium, which is today the home of NATO. Switzerland has generally resonated as the leading emblem of neutrality. The Swiss have shunned alliances, refused to join the European Union, acted as intermediary between opposing countries, and only joined the United Nations 20 years ago, even though it has hosted the UN's European headquarters for decades. But the Swiss lined up with European Union sanctions against Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. Other countries too have strayed from neutrality in the strictest sense. Swedish forces are taking part in NATO's winter weather exercises in neighboring Norway. Finland has long resisted joining NATO, but Moscow's actions in Ukraine have been changing the dynamic. Some countries, particularly those close to Russia in Central and Eastern Europe, have gravitated close to NATO and become members and eschewed neutrality out of concern it would convey weakness and vulnerability and that Moscow could seize on that. Now, what alternatives are on the table for Ukraine and Russia? Historian Lewis Müller held up Austria, which has kept its distance from NATO, as a conceivable model for Ukraine. After World War II, Austria, which before the war had been united with Nazi Germany, was occupied by forces from four Allied powers: Britain, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union. In 1955, those four powers decided to pull out their occupying forces and let Austria be independent, but only after Moscow insisted that Austria's parliament first write into constitution a guarantee of neutrality. Müller, a history professor at Stockholm University and author of the book Neutrality in World History, said, "I think that's the solution that they are thinking about at the moment because it worked for Australia." Now, still, Müller doubted whether a diplomatic exit ramp can be found just yet after so much blood has spilled on both sides in the conflict. Now, would neutrality offer an exit route to the crisis? Enshrining the neutrality of Ukraine into any deal could help diminish the military threat that Russia perceives from it, especially as a possible NATO member. Ukraine insists it has no hostile intent towards Russia, but has been sidling up to the alliance to ensure its security. For years, Russian authorities, from Putin on down, have bristled about NATO's gradual creep eastward after the Cold War when the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact alliance disappeared. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are the former Soviet republics now in NATO. A brief war in 2008 between Russia and Georgia, which led to the de facto accession of two Georgian territories from its national map, put Georgia's own ambitions to join NATO into a deep freeze. As Ukraine gravitated closer to the west in 2014, Russia annexed the Black Sea Peninsula of Crimea, and pro-Russian separatists seized controls of parts of eastern Ukraine in 2014, boosting Kiev's desire to join NATO, even if it was admittedly a long way off. After a continued cozying up between NATO and Ukraine, including with weapons and advisors, Russia reached a boiling point last year. That's it for this podcast. Thank you so much for listening. To join KSG India courses and to crack the ICE exam, visit ksgindia.com. You can also get a PDF of this podcast on ksgindia.com. Thanks for listening.